Today at T-Mobile, I'm joined by a special co-anchor.
What up, everybody? It's your boy, Big Snoop Deal Double G.
Snoop, where can people go to find great deals?
Head to T-Mobile.com and get 4 iPhone 16s with Apple Intelligence on us, plus 4 lines for $25.
That's quite a deal, Snoop. And when you switch to T-Mobile, you can save versus the other big guys' comparable plans plus streaming.
Respect. We up out of here.
See how you can save on wireless and streaming versus the other big guys at T-Mobile.com/switch. Apple Intelligence requires iOS 18.1 or later.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be.
At T-Mobile, our critical mission is providing unparalleled 5G coverage for when connectivity is mission critical. Introducing T-Priority, America's best 5G network experience for first responders, even in times of congestion. More capacity, faster speeds, better coverage. T-Priority from T-Mobile, built for tomorrow's emergencies, ready today. Discover more at t-priority.com.
For qualifying organizations on eligible rate plans, coverage not available in some areas and may be impacted by emergencies.
Oh, wonder-working power in the precious...
Incredible as they seem, are not the results of mass hysteria.
You may wish to adjust the dial. You're currently tuned into the wrong station. The day Hobbs' grandson was born, a man in green arrived on the doorstep at twilight. This man was not like other men. He was very tall, and his skin was pale gray, like marble. His green velvet doublet was thick as moss. His eyes were green as well. Not green like eyes are sometimes green, but green like the glow of fungus in the woods at night. He was a stranger. It might have been polite to welcome him inside, but it can be dangerous to welcome a stranger into your home. So, instead, the new grandfather welcomed him, told the stranger his joyous news, and invited him to sit with him on the front stoop, enjoying a jar of ale. It was a clever way to be hospitable while still keeping the stranger out of his house. And by the smile in the stranger's eyes, Hob realized the stranger saw right through him, but wasn't offended. "I would enjoy that greatly," the stranger said. So Hob went inside and told his family to stay calm, and returned with 2 jars of ale from the cold room cask, and then he and the stranger sat together watching the yellow sky dim, and the birds flicker after gnats, and the breeze in the oak trees. It was a pleasant hour, with the stranger spreading out his long legs and complimenting the quality of the ale. "My wife Alice makes it herself. She'll be pleased to hear you said that. At this moment, I would not trade it for any crystal vintage, however ageless, that chills in the glass cellars of Presidium Major," said the stranger. "Well, sir, I can only say that neither would I." But here the stranger wrinkled his pale brow, and turned to the man with somber countenance. "But I did not come here, Hob, to drink thy wife's ale and listen to symphonies of crickets at the sunset." He leaned forward, dangling the mug between his sharp knees. I came to make a prophecy on thy grandson's birth. Ah, whether thou willest it, or I will it, or no, the prophecy shall be made. I am but its courier, and in my experience, it is best to do these things in the proper manner, Hob. Well, said Hob, I suppose so. Then he drained his mug and stood, and welcomed the stranger into his home. All of Hob's family were gathered inside. Alice, his son Eric and son-in-law John, and his daughter Margot, pale in bed but otherwise healthy, with the newborn baby in her arms. They had been waiting in anxious silence, quietly praying Hob would be safe from the stranger's machinations. Their eyes went wide as Hob walked in, and the stranger ducked beneath the lintel behind him. Even with his green chaperon removed, the stranger didn't quite fit in their little house. He was taller than the wardrobe by their hearth. I am Theron Cand, he told them. He might just as well have said he were the devil himself. It would be best if I could see the baby. And though every drop of blood drained from Margot's face, she held up the child as the stranger's shadow fell across him. The infant looked up, unafraid or unseeing, even as the great talon of Theron Cand caressed the air above his head. The stranger closed his eyes and flinched slightly, as if he'd seen something he didn't like in the dark space behind his eyelids. A cruel destiny is laid upon this boy, the stranger declared, opening his eyes to look down at the child. If he lives to come of age, he will kill his own grandfather. The pronouncement was greeted with silence. The stranger sighed. Maybe the sadness in that sigh was less than wholly genuine. I am sorry, Hob, he said, turning for the door. Such a prophecy is bad payment for such fine ale. But whether it is fair or not, it is the truth. He bent to the door, but hesitated on the threshold, looking back with a trace of cruel humor. My body and blood, Hob, he said on his way out. Whatever shall you do? That night, as Hob and Alice lay in bed together, she asked him the same question. They were curled into each other under the sheets. The world was enormous and hostile beyond their walls. The wind was shaking against their blinds. I don't want to lose you, Hob, she told him. I don't want you to lose me either. She pressed her forehead against him, squeezing her eyes shut, as if by clenching her body tightly enough she could keep this moment where the two of them were together, as if she could make it last. Oh, God, what are we going to do? Hob held her in his arms. I know exactly what we'll do, he said. Say nothing of this prophecy, Hob told his family the next morning. But the coming and going of strangers is remarked upon, and anyway, nothing can stay secret in a small town. Before too long, the people of the village seemed to know every detail of the prophecy. It was as if the wind and the birds themselves had told them. The boy, ironically, had already been named after his grandfather before the stranger arrived. But after such a soothsaying, nobody could stand to call him Hob. What they settled on in the end was young Robert, and when they spoke about him, they had little good to say. The baby was too quiet. When the colorlessness of infancy cleared, his eyes were an unsettling shade of green. When Margot walked through town with young Robert on her hip, people would cross to the other side of the street and turn their eyes down. That were no prophecy but a curse, Maeve told the other washerwomen by the river. Then she sniffed and looked around at the trees to make sure they weren't overheard. Were best, they did. The sensible thing about it. Of course, killing an infant was out of the question. But even in those days, it wasn't so rare to leave one in the woods and let nature take its course. How does it feel to be the father of a murderer? Absalom Sott asked John one evening. when he and the other hands were drinking ale by the hayrick after a long day's work. And though John's face turned red and his hand shook, he bent his head and said not one word in defense of his newborn son. So, like any child born under an evil star, young Robert grew up strange, with a shadow around him. But Hob acted as though he loved him, and every night Margot would pass the baby into his arms and they would go outside together. And every night she would wonder if this was the night that her father would come back empty-handed. And every night she tormented herself with the thought that maybe that would be for the best. But every night, her father would just sit on the stoop with his grandson in his arms, singing to him in a soft voice while the world grew soft and the starlings murmured in the mulberry trees. When young Robert was 5, he fell sick, as children often did in those days, deathly sick, and when the news went around the town, many people nodded and looked significantly at one another. Maybe it was for the best. Maybe they were all being spared. I still say the time to deal with it all was right at the start, said Maeve, with her arms red from the washing. But if it happens out of sheer luck, well, maybe that's not luck. That's providence, is all I'm saying. But when the boy lingered and didn't die, a new rumor went round. Well, I just think it's a little convenient is all, said Absalom at the polished bar of the tavern. We all know what the boy's going to do. So if Hob did it to him first, well, who'd blame him? Not that I'm saying that's what's happening for sure, of course, just that it's a little convenient. After all, a man can have a lot of grandsons, but he's only got the one life. Hob didn't hear these rumors. He spent those long weeks by his grandson's bed, reading him old stories from the leather-bound book his own grandfather had once read to him. He slept in the hard wooden chair at the foot of the boy's bed, and when the child woke up whimpering in the darkness, he would bring him water or a cool cloth, and bundle him up in his arms and rock him back and forth, saying, I'm here, it's okay, I'm here. Once, when the boy was sleeping, Alice came to stand by the door. Are you ever tempted? She whispered. Hob looked down at the boy's sleeping face, at the clean white pillow beside him. It would be very easy. Of course I am, he said. Young Robert survived his illness, but either through natural disposition or as a result of this early brush with death, he became fascinated by the macabre. While other children would flee from the sight of a decayed cat in the brush behind a barn, he would crouch beside it and study the trawling insects for hours at a time. When the old woman who lived in the cottage at the end of the field died, he would still speak about her. There she is, he would say, pointing to some shadow in the corner of the room, some flicker of the candlelight while his family tried to eat. She's come to visit us again. Because the other children shunned and bullied him, he would often walk alone and for a long time in the woods at night, and in the daytime he would lie on his belly in the long green grass of the graveyard, searching for buried headstones, trying to feel out the weathered-away names with his fingertips. In the village he was not well liked. But Hob would come and join him when he crouched at the dead cat's body by the barn, and he would listen as young Robert pointed out the different kinds of insects that he saw in the body of the rotting cat, and he would ask what the boy felt when he saw those flickers that reminded him of the woman at the end of the field. And young Robert would say how kind she'd always been to him, how she always gave him a cup of milk from the cold room, and Hob would sometimes walk with the boy at night to watch fireflies come out and listen to the ghost stories his grandson had heard by eavesdropping on the other children. And he would warm his bones with the boy in the graveyard sun and try to remember things about the families whose names came up on the buried stones. When the boy was almost 10, Hob went up the hill where his grandfather was buried, because it was the old man's birthday and Hob still liked to pay his respects. It was a cloudy day, no sun, the kind where it gets dark as an eclipse by mid of the afternoon. One moment he was alone with the headstone. Then, suddenly, the stranger was beside him. "Well, Hob," the stranger said, "thy time is running out. In only a few years thy challenger shall have thee by thy throat." Hob said nothing. The stranger laughed. "Many a king, you know, hath tasted the executioner's blade at their son's behest, or else wound down their days immured in a tower." "I'm no king," Hob muttered. But again the stranger laughed. "And well thou showest why thou art not. Such kindness hath ever been the death of mighty men." "I'm not a mighty man." No, of course," the stranger taunted. "I read thee well, my humble friend. Mighty thou may not be, but subtler far than most men of your rank. Thou hopest by gentleness to turn the prophecy aside. Thou think'st that if you treat the boy with kindness, he may spare you." "No," said Hob. "That's not what I think." "Ah, then think'st I have deceived you with my prophecy?" "Why not? Not every prophecy is true." "Mine are," the stranger gloated. "As shalt see. But answer me this. If all this love thou heapest on the boy but beareth meagre fruit, what then? If thou lovest the child, and the child yet destroys thee, then what good hath all thy efforts been?" Hob said nothing. And then the stranger, laughing, was gone. When the boy was almost 12, he turned to his grandfather one afternoon with his green eyes strange in the graveyard sun. "You know I'm going to kill you someday, right?" And though Hob was chilled to the heart, he smiled and said, "Well, if you think that it's right." Despite the warnings of the prophecy, young Robert lived to come of age. He became a quiet young man who kept mostly to himself. Those same people who would cross the street to avoid his mother when he was a baby now crossed the street to avoid him as a man. If he minded this treatment, then he learned to keep that to himself. He had few friends. He worked quietly and well, and in his spare time he would sit by the river or in the trees, listening to the sound of the wind and feeling the greenness of the grass underneath him. If he ever encountered a strange, tall man all dressed in green, he never mentioned it. As he grew, he became a little distant from his parents, as often happens. John, after all those years under the eyes of his neighbors, had wanted his son to prove them all wrong, to grow into someone handsome and charming, a big man around the village. But his son had failed to, and the father, though he didn't realize it about himself and would never have been able to put it into words, was hurt, betrayed. He felt his son had yielded to the most shameful parts of his nature, and so there was always tension between them when they sat across the dinner table. Margot had gone in the other direction, seeing how the children would chant little cruel songs at young Robert, or even throw rocks at him when they thought they could get away with it, and seeing how the other adults of the village would turn a glazed eye toward him, she became protective, fierce, and smothering. The closer she held him, the harder he struggled to breathe free air. And there was always something standing between the boy and his grandmother as well. Alice loved him dearly, and yet there was a part of her that couldn't forget what he was supposed to do. And so, in spite of herself, she could never love to him in a simple and uncomplicated way. And so, one of the few people he spent much time with was Hob. They would sit together often on the old man's stoop, drinking a mug of Alice's good amber ale at twilight, with young Robert's long legs stretched out, as the stranger's had once stretched out from that very seat. "Do "Do you ever wonder," he asked Hob once, "if I'll really do it? Are you ever just waiting for me to suddenly turn on you?" Hob grunted. He thought for a minute, swirled the good clay mug and raised it to his nose, smelling the yeast and malt. "Sure I am," he said at length. "Wouldn't you be?" This made the young man cross his arms across his belly, as if sick. "Then how can you stand to look at me?" he asked. "How can you stand to be around me? Most of the people barely can. And you most of all, have every reason to—" He petered out, hunched over himself and looking at his shoes. "Well, sometimes I wonder about that myself," said Hob, looking out at the yellow twilight. "But what I keep coming back to is I just like you a lot." The boy looked up at him, with confusion bordering on horror. Hob shrugged. "And if the day comes when that changes, maybe that's how it's gotta be. But for now, I get to sit here drinking good ale with my grandson. And I figure I've got to enjoy that while I can." Then, suddenly, Hob was old. He had been spry for so long, despite his white hair, that it surprised him as much as anyone. Between one New Year and the next, he found the strength had gone out of his hands, and that he could no longer hike up to the hilltop where his grandfather was buried. His hearing and eyesight faded a little more slowly, but he could feel the world closing in around him all the same. Then one day he found that food had lost its savor, and he knew what that meant. Not long afterward, the pain began. It took the form of an endless, dull ache, and he could track the progress of his ailment as it spread through his bones, and as the pain blackened in the places where it had first appeared. He could no longer make it out to listen to crickets on the front stoop. He could only watch the yellow twilight through the corner of his window. He was a lucky man. Alice was still with him, and Margot and John and Eric and his wife and children still lived in the village, and so he had people to visit him and distract him from the pain. Young Robert stayed by his bedside more than anyone but Alice, reading him stories from the same old leather-bound book, and putting a cool cloth to his head from time to time. Then, one afternoon, when young Robert reached out to cool his forehead, Hob grabbed hold of his wrist with all the strength he still had in him. "Rob," he told his grandson, "it's time." And young Robert, understanding, bit back tears and glanced up to where Alice sat waiting in the corner. She nodded through her own tears, and young Robert left the cool cloth on his grandfather's head and stood up and left the house. He climbed up to the top of the hill where his grandfather's grandfather was buried. It was twilight. The yellow sky was growing dim, and the birds flickered after gnats among the breeze-blown oak leaves. A tall stranger was waiting for him at the hilltop. "Thou art young Robert," the stranger said. "I am," said the young man. "I think you know me very well." The stranger smiled. "Thy grandfather offered me the kindness of a drink once. I regret to say I never paid him back." Young Robert felt his tears begin to burn. "It's not too late." The stranger nodded, his gray face solemn, and he reached under his cloak of mossy velvet to produce a crystal cup and a small flask of the darkest wine. "This vintage has chilled ageless in my crystal cellars. Give it to thy grandsire with my compliments. He has done well." Young Robert accepted the flask and cup, and then the stranger was gone. He walked slowly home as the sky turned black and the stars came out. When he arrived at the threshold, his family were all gathered, waiting. At Hobbs' bedside, he poured that darkest wine into the crystal cup, and because Hobbs' hands had grown too weak, he held the glass and tilted it as his grandfather drank. And then, as he smiled through tears and held his grandfather's hand, the prophecy was fulfilled. The Wrong Station is made possible with the generous support of our listeners on Patreon. Visit today at patreon.com/thewrongstation. You can also support us by leaving a rating and review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever it is you tune into the show. This surprise episode, Prophecy, was written by Alexander Saxton and performed by Anthony Botello. Thank you to Ginny Jane Minute, Andrew Zimnick, Cthulhu Action Jackson, Ethan Soderberg, Radiclu, Elizabeth Gobin, Pixie Lyons, Cassie Carruth, Aaron Irvine, and Noah Myers for helping us keep the lights, well, off. The Wrong Station is co-produced by Alexander Saxton, Anthony Botello, and Jacob Duarte Spiel, with music composed and performed by Alon Citron and arranged for the viola and performed by Viola Schmidt. You can follow The Wrong Station on social media at The Wrong Station and email us at thewrongstation@gmail.com. And until next time, thank you for listening.